Hello, my name is Bruce Douville, and I teach at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie. My presentation today is called Always Look on the Bright Side of Anti-Blasphemy Laws, Religious Conservative Reaction to the Life of Brian. When we think about 19th and 20th century laws prohibiting blasphemy, we know that there were ancient precedents. For example, in the Torah, the people of Israel were expected to show due reverence for God by not misusing his name. This led to the Jewish tradition of never uttering the name of God, a practice that the British comedy troupe Monty Python chose to satirize in one scene of their 1979 film, The Life of Brian. In this scene, set in first century Judea, a man was sentenced to death by stoning for, quote, uttering the name of our Lord, and so as a blasphemer. But I digress. While there are ancient precedents to these laws, some might be surprised to discover how recently they've been employed. For example, in 1979, here in Ontario, a showing of Monty Python's The Life of Brian resulted in a charge of blasphemous libel. This incident in Canadian legal history is significant because it shines a spotlight on the legal mechanisms employed to enforce standards of public decency in film. More importantly, as Dr. Ian Ellis has written, the film's release coincided with the resurgence of conservatism in several countries, and especially the rise of a new transnational religious right eager to flex its muscles. The campaigns to censor or boycott The Life of Brian reflected an older tradition of activists using the law to combat violations of public decency, but they also evinced the new spirit of the religious right. This paper is intended to be a very preliminary exploration of the transnational backlash against Monty Python's Life of Brian, with particular attention to the blasphemous libel case to which I alluded. I hope to address two sets of questions. First of all, what does this global backlash tell us about state censorship of controversial works in the late 1970s, particularly here in Ontario? Secondly, but more importantly, what does this tell us about the nature of the religious right circa 1979-1980? I'll begin with the origins of the movie and the intentions of its creators. The members of the Monty Python troupe initially planned on making a comedy film about Jesus Christ. But as troupe member Eric Idle explained, the interesting thing we found was that Jesus Christ was not pervious to comedy. There's nothing he says that you can laugh at. Nobody mocks what's said in the Sermon on the Mount. So rather than focusing on Jesus, the filmmakers decided to lampoon those who, in their estimation, were inclined to misinterpret Jesus. Ultimately, they decided on a movie set in first century Judea about a fictional character named Brian, who was born in Bethlehem at about the same time as Jesus, but next door. As an adult, Brian quickly accumulates a large group of followers convinced that he is the anointed savior that God would send to the people of Judea to save them. But Brian didn't want to be the center of a Messiah craze. He believed that people needed to figure things out for themselves. Throughout the film, Monty Python managed to skewer the radical left, to make Pontius Pilate look like a fool, to criticize inflexible dogmatic certainty on religious matters, and in general to parody the biblical epic films of the 1950s, like Ben-Hur and so on, or the Ten Commandments. The movie ends with Brian hanging on a cross among a large group of the crucified as they sing an eerily cheery yet somewhat cynical song about looking on the bright side of both life and death. Well, the film's creators insisted that this wasn't a film about Jesus. There was no question that Brian's life paralleled that of Jesus in several respects. Also, Jesus appears in the film twice, once at his birth and once again as an adult delivering the Sermon on the Mount. While Jesus himself is portrayed respectfully, the movie seems to critique faith in any Messiah, at least implying that zealous faith in a Savior is somewhat comical and irrational. And it pokes fun at the trappings and or tenets of organized religion, and that includes both Christianity and Judaism. From the get-go, the large production studios were hesitant to even touch this film because they knew that it would be controversial. The members of Monty Python certainly knew that, and apparently looked forward to the controversy that it would provoke. Terry Gilliam remarked that he loved the thought that the film would open a hornet's nest. John Cleese recalled, "We knew that there would be some trouble, but in a funny kind of way, there wasn't that much in England." Well, yes and no. Indeed, the film passed the British censors, but it did face concerted opposition from Mary Whitehouse, an evangelical Christian who, between the 1950s and 1990s, waged war relentlessly against sex, violence, and blasphemy in British television and the movies. Through the efforts of Mary Whitehouse and a letter-writing campaign of religious conservatives, some municipal councils were persuaded to ban screenings of the film, but it played in all of the major cities. And as one might expect, the efforts to get the film banned only fanned the flames of its success. I like to think of this as the Father Ted effect. In the UK, the most memorable confrontation over the life of Brian took place on live television in 1979 on the show Friday Night, Saturday Morning, in which Tim Rice chaired a debate between two Christian critics of the film and two members of Monty Python. The Christian critics were an unlikely pairing, the conservative journalist Malcolm Muggeridge and the politically left-leaning, theologically liberal Bishop of Southwark, Mervyn Stockwood. In the interview, John Cleese and Michael Palin of Monty Python insisted that their film was not ridiculing Christ, but rather the people that misunderstood him. However, they also took unsubtle jabs at institutional Christianity. In contrast, Muggeridge and Stockwood insisted that The Life of Brian was an attack on Christianity and had unsubtle jabs towards the film itself. Muggeridge called it a 10th-rate film. Stockwood derided it as undergraduate humor. Needless to say, none of this press coverage did anything to diminish the popularity of the film in the UK. Now, the opposition proved to be more intense in the United States. As Python member Terry Gilliam recalled euphemistically, in New York was where it really got interesting. In August of 1979, a coalition of Orthodox Jewish rabbis denounced the film as, quote, a vicious attack on Judaism, citing the stoning scene that I mentioned earlier. Significantly, their spokesman, Rabbi Abraham Hecht of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, noted that, quote, blasphemy and sacrilege are not protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. In other words, he was implying that they could resort to legal action. Hecht's statement ambiguously implied that some might resort to extra-legal action as well. He said that the movie was, quote, so grievously insulting that the rabbis are genuinely concerned that its continued showing could ultimately result in serious violence. He added that the film makes, quote, a cruel mockery of the religious feelings of Christians as well. And indeed, that seems to be the case. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York denounced it as blasphemy, while the Lutheran Council declared it a disgraceful assault on the Christian faith. Throughout late 1979, American Christians of various denominations picketed showings of the film and petitioned the relevant authorities to have it banned, with some success in states as diverse as Maine and Georgia. In South Carolina, Reverend William Solomon, a Presbyterian minister, was outraged that the film, quote, held up to deliberate ridicule my faith in Jesus Christ and made fun of his suffering. Secondly, the movie definitely is anti-Semitic and heavy on derogatory terms applied to the Jewish people. Finally, it was not art. It was cruel and sarcastic, but it was not art. So said Reverend William Solomon, who ended up contacting Nancy Thurmond, the wife of ultra-conservative Senator Strom Thurmond, and she was able to persuade her elderly politician husband to intervene. The upshot? The film was effectively censored in South Carolina. Unless anybody think that this kind of heavy-handed opposition was unique to the United States, remember that the film had been banned in parts of England, Wales, and Germany. It was banned entirely in Ireland for 8 years, and it was even banned in Norway for a year, for which reason Life of Brian was advertised in Sweden as, quote, the film so funny that it was banned in Norway. As it turns out, Canada was not free from censorious religious critics either. And this is where, for me, the story takes a local turn. You've probably noted that the opposition was more successful in smaller, more marginal locations than in the largest urban centers. Perhaps this reflects a greater prevalence of social conservatism in small communities. Or perhaps it reflects the fact that the levers of power are such in smaller communities that individuals or small groups of citizens can prevail upon the authorities to get their way. So it was that in November 1979, charges of blasphemous libel were laid against the manager and operators of the Station Mall Cinema in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, because the theater had been showing Monty Python's Life of Brian. Police had pressed charges as a result of a complaint privately laid by Reverend Michael Eldred, an Anglican priest. Eldred, who ministered to a parish on nearby St. Joseph's Island, claimed to be acting on behalf of his parishioners who had approached him with their concerns, quote, that the movie was blasphemous and held the scriptures to ridicule. 3 points are worth stressing here. First of all, police laid these charges in spite of the fact that the film was cleared by the Ontario Censor Board. Second, Section 296 of the Criminal Code, Blasphemous Libel, was a little-used law written into the Criminal Code in 1892. It had been used famously in the 1920s to prosecute Eugene Victor Sterry, a Toronto atheist who was jailed and then deported to England for insulting the Christian faith. That was the last time it had been used in Ontario until these charges were laid in 1979. Third, since 1979, nobody had been charged with blasphemous libel. Just to give you a picture of the communities we're talking about, Sault Ste. Marie is located along Highway 17, Trans-Canada Highway, roughly at the center point of the Three Great Lakes, about an 8-hour drive northwest of Toronto. In 1979, it was a heavily blue-collar community, the largest employer being Algoma Steel. Had a population of about 80,000. It had 4 indoor movie theaters, all in the downtown core, and the Station Mall Cinema, whose manager and operators were charged, was the newest, located in the relatively new Station Mall, completed in 1973, which you see more or less in the center of that picture at the bottom. As for St. Joseph's Island, the location of Reverend Eldredge's Anglican parish, it was a rural community, about 45 minutes east of the Sault, known for maple syrup, corn, wild deer, wild turkeys, and mostly tame Americans who have summer cottages there. As for the key players in this story, I've yet to find out much about Reverend Michael Eldred himself. From some internet sleuthing, I knew that he was ordained as a deacon in the Diocese of Algoma in 1975, serving first in Sudbury and then serving as a priest on St. Joseph's Island from 1976 until 1982. In 1979, he would have been a young man, about 30 years old. I don't know much about his social or theological views, but all evidence suggests that the label conservative fits the bill. Assuming that it's the same Michael Eldred from what else I found on the internet, he later served in a traditionalist Episcopal parish in Placentia, California, and in recent years converted from Episcopalian to Roman Catholic. But of his years in the Algoma region, where he launched the complaint that led to blasphemous libel charges, I know very little. I can speculate that perhaps Michael Eldred was involved in the charismatic renewal, a movement that was particularly strong in the 1970s and early 1980s across North America, across the globe really, but also here in Algoma, which introduced Catholics and Anglicans to Pentecostal-style spirituality. While charismatics stayed in their Roman Catholic, Anglican, or other mainline churches, their experiential spirituality and their warm personal faith led them to identify more closely with evangelical Christianity, and it likely led them to align more closely politically with conservative evangelicals. As I said, this was an era of the resurgent religious right, and Canadian charismatics and evangelicals were undoubtedly influenced by what was happening south of the border. Okay, it wasn't the perfect mirror, but there was certainly influence. Speaking as somebody who spent my childhood years in a charismatic evangelical Anglican household, I can say with confidence that these trends were evident in my Northern Ontario community. So, was Reverend Michael Eldred a part of that? I can't say. It is possible. What is certain is that his actions in 1979 would seem to align him with the kind of religious conservatism that was making headway across North America in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So, what became of this case? First of all, Villa Theatres Company, which operated Station Mall Cinema, decided to keep showing the films anyway, and to fight the charges, as Peter Sorok, a principal in the company, told the press, "The police have overridden the censor's jurisdiction. Our impression has always been, if the censor passed a film, the police couldn't touch you. This casts a new light." The theater's chain, its decision to fight the charges likely reflected a confidence that the courts would rule in their favor. And in the end, the court process was short-circuited because the province stepped in. The Attorney General's office asserted that the province had the right to prosecute a charge involving an indictable offense, but they reviewed the life of Brian. They reviewed the case, they reviewed the film, and concluded that it was not in the interests of the administration of justice to proceed. They felt that no offense had been committed. After all, the province's own film Censor Board had given the film a green light. Thus, the Attorney General's office asked for a stay of prosecution, and consequently charges were dropped in May 1980. It seems that the government did not wish to be cast in the role of killjoy and heavy-handed censor, particularly if the case would likely end in humiliating defeat. In the courthouse in Sault Ste. Marie, this scene played out that May. Crown Attorney Norm Douglas, who incidentally was a devout evangelical Christian, informed Judge James Greco that he was instructed by the Attorney General's office not to proceed. There would be no preliminary hearing. And upon receiving this news in the courtroom, Reverend Eldred told the court that he was assured he would have his day in court, and that by not proceeding with the case, the Attorney General was denying him the law. Judge Greco responded that, quote, "The courtroom was not a forum for public discussion," and suggested that Mr. Eldred consult the Crown Attorney. Michael Eldred informed the press that he would continue, quote, "to pursue his attempt to have the movie Life of Brian banned in Ontario. Quote, I will go the political route to the Premier of the province if necessary in order to have the movie banned." But as far as I can tell, his efforts fizzled out after that. So, what does this tell us about the powers of state to regulate and censor creative work? First of all, there were means other than blasphemous libel laws that were employed in Ontario to regulate and censor. Foremost among these, there was the Ontario Censor Board, which was empowered to order cuts to films or to ban films outright. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the Ontario Censor Board was a source of grief for the Toronto Festival of Festivals, now known as the Toronto International Film Festival. For example, in 1978, when the festival was going to show the film In Praise of Older Women, the board required that it cut a 2-minute simulated sex scene. Try saying that 7 times very fast. Now, with The Life of Brian, the film was spared from legal trouble because of the Ontario Censor Board, which had deemed the film acceptable. But even this bothered critics of the provincial censors. For example, in a letter to the Globe and Mail in May 1980, William McMaster, a young legal scholar from Osgoode Law School at York, complained that Ontario's censorship laws substituted the decisions of a provincially appointed board operating behind closed doors for the open court, where people could be tried in accordance with federal law. In cases such as the life of Brian, McMaster contended that the courts were best able to determine standards of public decency. Quote, "What we, the public, must decide is which process is to be preferred, the open hearing in a court of law or the covert practice that at present exists. If the province voluntarily abolishes censorship, not classification, the former will take its rightful place, and we will know what decisions are being made for us." In the 1980s, the province did, in fact, make changes to the Theatres Act, and it reined in the operation of the Censorship Board, much to the relief of the Toronto International Film Festival. And furthermore, in 2005, the Provincial Theatres Act was replaced by the Film Classification Act. Now, as for Section 296 of the Criminal Code, blasphemous libel, this federal law remained on the books until 2018, when it was eliminated on grounds that it was incompatible with the Charter. It was nearly 4 decades after charges had been laid against the manager and operators of the Station Mall Cinema that this law is finally kaput. But in those intervening decades, nobody was charged, and it's highly unlikely that such a charge would have withstood a challenge on grounds of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, finally, what does this tell us about the religious right circa 1979 or 1970? Well, first of all, not all of the film's critics fall comfortably in the camp of the religious right. For example, the English bishop Mervyn Stockwood was a theological liberal, a supporter of gay rights, and as we know now, he himself was a homosexual. And he was a committed Labour Party member. But most of the critics pretty much do fall in the camp of the religious right. And for those that do, it's worth observing that none of this kind of conservative activism was really new. Censoring works of art that violated standards of public decency or challenged prevalent religious viewpoints. There are many instances of such cases in the UK and North America throughout the 20th century, including some particularly famous ones in the late 20th century. Later, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl. Even if the religious right had not been gathering strength in the late 70s and early 80s, the life of Brian still would have generated a transnational blowback. In any event, the controversy only added to the notoriety of the film, which didn't hurt it one bit in the box office. So, in some ways, this isn't really a new right phenomena, but nevertheless, the context of the newly resurgent right, it does matter. Networks were being established and had been established, the new networks of the religious right. And this made organizing opposition to the film more effective. For example, in England, Mary Whitehouse's organization, the Festival of Light, was the one that really orchestrated the campaign against the life of Brian in the UK. And as well, I think the resurgent religious right emboldened individual conservative activists, even if there were limits to the effectiveness of these folks, like Mary Whitehouse or Strom Thurmond, or in the case of our story here, Reverend Michael Eldred. But furthermore, I think the new religious right did matter too, because we see this happening again. As the 1980s progressed, evangelical Christians were even more vocal in their criticism of problematic representations of Christ or Christianity, whether in film or television or art. The 1988 Scorsese film, The Last Temptation of Christ, is a case in point, as is 1 year earlier, in 1987, the controversial Piss Christ by artist and photographer Andres Serrano. I will conclude by observing that while American and British faith-based groups met with some success in their fight against the life of Brian, it seems that such efforts were less successful in Canada. In fact, there do not appear, from what I can find so far, there do not appear to have been nationwide campaigns against the film in Canada, as there were in other jurisdictions. If there were, it would seem they were not of the same magnitude or the same success. The isolated example that briefly made national news involving Michael Eldred in the Station Mall Cinema in Sault Ste. Marie was the exception that proved the rule. In short, Canada was different. Sort of. The fate of the case would suggest that Canada's religious right was not always the perfect mirror of its international counterparts. Oh, and one final thing. Spam. Thank you.